Thank you so much, George Monbiot, for being prepared to join me for Eco-Judaism and Beyond, and renowned activist, journalist, author of many books, totally passionate about the restoration of our world for the future of humanity and all species. And really, really appreciate your being here. As I'm sure you know, we're approaching Tu B'Shvat, which is the new year for trees in the Jewish calendar, but is also a time to think completely about our relationship, not just with trees, but with nature as a whole. And I was just listening to a tiny fraction of what you've spoken and written, which is very passionate and very moving. I was curious about what motivated you, and you used an expression of the kind of the ecology environment, I think in Latin America, making you feel more alive than ever before. And that made me curious.
Mm. Well, I've always been obsessed with the natural world. Even when I was very, very small, apparently I would just follow the birds around with my eyes, and that was where my passion lay. I studied zoology at university, and then I went on to become an investigative journalist concentrating on environmental issues. And that took me, well, to quite a few interesting places, to West Papua and Indonesia, and then to Brazil. And it was really Brazil that gave me my political education and my understanding, I think, of the deeper issues behind my passion for protecting the living world, and my understanding that that has to be embedded in political, social, economic, cultural understanding. Otherwise, we just end up going round and round in circles. And my education came primarily from landless laborers, from the people who would later form the Movimento Sem Terra, the rural workers' unions. And these were mostly illiterate people, but with a very strong oral political tradition, and they effectively became my tutors.
In some ways, I relate that to the Hebrew Bible, which is a world so deeply aware of and connected with land, very conscious of drought, of rainfall, of the fauna and flora, of interdependence and dependence, all put in a framework of social justice as well. So to relate to that in a way. Is that what led you to a passion for rewilding? I noted that you said you wanted to devote then the rest of your life to the mass restoration of ecosystems, but that when you came back to Britain, you were ecologically bored. How have you been trying to live that, and how can we learn from you?
So this compresses a lot of time.
Sorry.
So I was a very young man, working in Brazil and elsewhere, and it took me a long time really to see my own country, and it had only really been as a result of spending so many years abroad, but also of just beginning to get to grips with what used to live here, what could live here, what does live here, and the amazing, terrible mess we've made of this of this country, the United Kingdom, and how depleted in nature we are. It wasn't really until I was living in Wales, in mid Wales, which was supposed to be a wild place. I was between Snowdonia and the Cambrian Mountains, and yet when I walked in almost any direction, you could walk all day long without seeing another human being, but also without seeing any wildlife. Literally a whole day, you might see 2 crows, possibly a pipit if you were lucky.
Is that what led you to create the word sheepwrecked and
Yes.
grouse trashed?
Yes, well, that's exactly it. That it was almost empty of people, but the sheep are a kind of fully automated system of environmental destruction, because they selectively browse out tree seedlings and a whole range of other species which are highly nutritious, and leave behind just 1 or 2 species of coarse grasses, which then come to dominate the ecosystem, and nothing else can live there. And most of our uplands, which should be very rich ecosystems, have almost no wildlife at all. So where I live now in the southwest of England, Dartmoor, for instance, should be covered in temperate rainforest, but it's really a wet desert of which is dominated by one species of grass. And
sorry,
carry
I
on.
want to plug for people to see your TED talk about the reintroduction of wolves and their effect on Yellowstone National Park. It's extraordinary and beautifully expressed. But I want to say I've just read Guy Shrubsole's The Lost Rainforests of Britain, which are a marvelous book.
Isn't it great? Yes, yes. And a guy lives in the same village as me, as it happens.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and we're both passionately concerned with what's happening around here. And he's done a great job of putting this most neglected of our ecosystems back on the map.
I suppose this will move towards, I want to ask you something, a further dimension first, but it'll move towards very important, what it is that we can do, and perhaps what it is we mustn't do and what it is that we can do. And I watched a YouTube with you about what I think, I'm not sure if it's your most recent book, Regenesis, which of course has a biblical echo of Genesis being the unfolding of creation with its richness, its diversity, and its beauty, and then our destruction of that, and the need to sort of and you focus very much there on farming. What must we not do? And then I'm going to ask you, what must we yes do?
So sure. So of course we valorize, we celebrate farming, and we all depend on farming. But it's also the worst thing we've ever done to the planet. It's by far and away the biggest cause of habitat destruction, of wildlife loss, of species loss, of land use, of water use, of soil degradation. One of the greatest causes of climate breakdown, of water pollution, of air pollution. And yet we've created a kind of moral force field around it so that we don't subject it to the same standards that we might subject any other industry. And as a result, we are kind of blind to those impacts, and we affect to ignore them. And even if we addressed all the other issues which are hammering life on Earth, we would still see the collapse of Earth systems driven entirely by our food production systems alone. So we have to address those, and we have to make farming both more productive in terms of how we farm and what we do, but also reducing its impacts at the same time. And this is a very challenging thing. One major aspect of this is moving away from an animal-based diet towards a plant-based diet, which has a far lighter footprint.
No, thanks. And it's interesting that when I look at the world of the Bible, which Judaism permits meat eating, it would appear that it was a rare luxury and not a regularly consumed project, but a product. But no, that's all something, just again to say to people, find that and listen to that. It's very, very stirring. What about the can do? One of the projects that we've created working with the Woodland Trust in this country and the International Tree Foundation is J-Tree, which we're featuring for the Jewish New Year for trees. Rewilding, rethinking our consumer habits. What can we contribute to the restoration of ecosystems? And I'm going to have a particular question there, which is, what do you feel faith communities can offer?
I think faith communities are a crucial part of this story, that we have to be able to tell stories that reach people and mobilize people. And those stories will differ slightly according to who we're talking to. The facts don't change. We have to be true to the empirical science of the situation, which is absolutely crucial. But we should embed those facts within stories which are meaningful and which motivate people to act. And as you've been saying, that there are plenty of religious stories which we can draw on and build on and refer to in trying to reach communities who might not yet be switched on to some of the issues that we're talking about. But we should also be mindful of the fact that both religious and political transformations throughout history have taken place with the help of very strong, powerful narratives. And as environmentalists, we have neglected that narrative role. We've neglected the importance of narrative. And I think we have a great deal to learn from religious traditions in how to motivate people, in how to encourage people to come together and fight for a better world.
That I appreciate that. And it sets me thinking of how best to use narrative to motivate people within our religious traditions. But I'm also aware, and when I talk about these matters in my community, there's a lot of assent, but there's not a similar amount of action. And one of the lines that I wrote down from what I read of yours was the failure of environmental movements often to go from love to action. I think your words were to fail to translate our love of nature into action. What are the actions that, I mean, perhaps that's too specific a question. Would you have a top list of 2 or 3 actions that you would,
Sure.
the people who are going to take away from you the power of what you say can go and do?
Sure. So just to fill out that thought a little bit, in the UK, we are absolutely obsessed with wildlife programs. We have 8 million members of conservation groups, and yet we have one of the most nature depleted countries on earth. And so there's this massive disconnect between what we love and what we do. And part of that is, a general political disconnection where we are less prepared to act than we should be on a whole range of issues, social and economic and political, as well as environmental. And one of the drivers of that, I think, is the way we've been atomized and ruled. We've suffered from the extreme individuation really thrust upon us by successive governments who they don't want us to come together to change things, because that is a threat to political power. So what we need to do is to come together to change things. We're constantly being told that we're consumers and that the change we must institute must be at the individual level and should be exercised through the things that we buy. But we are very weak as consumers, and we can make very little difference as consumers. In fact, the most powerful thing you can do as a consumer is not to consume, but that gives you no power over the system as a whole. It gives you no power over what anybody else is doing. We're far more powerful as citizens, and that's how we should see ourselves. And we should come together and act collectively in pursuit of well-articulated aims. And of course, as soon as you do that, then you realize why power is afraid, and you start to recognize the extraordinary power of people coming together. And that power is enhanced by the knowledge that society, being a complex system, has got tipping points. And we now know pretty clearly where those tipping points are. It's roughly 25%. If you have 25% of people committed to a new idea, it's very hard for anyone to stop that new idea from happening.
And one of the things,
we don't have to persuade everyone. We just have to persuade a quarter of the population, and other people fall into line because they perceive that the social wind has changed.
And one of the things which is I'm hearing is so powerful, the Jewish community in this country is really quite small, but working together with other faiths, which we do in environment, there's a feeling of a much, much stronger case, and a moral and communal case. Just
to add to that, if I may, Jonathan, the great thing is, you've already got the community. You've already got a circle of like-minded people, and that gives you a sort of powerful head start over those of us who live effectively in atomized communities. And so this is another reason why religious communities can be a big part of the change that we need to see.
I'm very keen to hear and learn much more from you than this time will allow, but I want to conclude with just seeing it's the new year for trees and the birthday of trees traditionally, a line about trees. I don't know whether it's something you love about trees or something you think is urgent about trees. Let's finish with something in praise of trees.
Yeah. So I want to praise dead trees, because when we think about trees, we think about live trees, and live trees are wonderful, but so are dead trees. And there's an old ecologist dictum that there's more life in a dead tree than there is in a living one. And that's because at every stage of decay, you get a whole different assemblage of wild animals and fungi and all sorts of other kingdoms, making use of that decay and eating different parts of the tree and eating each other. And then at the next stage, they're replaced by a whole load of others. And that tree in dying gives life to an entire ecosystem, and then gives life to the trees that follow. And we're far too tidy-minded, I think, in this country. You know, a tree dies, or we've got to cut it down and remove it, or it falls to the forest floor, we've got to cut it up and take it away. But in doing so, you're cutting off a major part of the ecosystem. We want old decaying things, and perhaps I'm particularly interested in this because I've just passed my 60th birthday, but we need
younger than me.
but we want old things full of holes and with lots of different stages of decay going on at the same time, and so trees bring life through death, and that's one of the extraordinary aspects of them that I love.
There's a line in Job that there is hope for the tree, but because it's got the capacity to regenerate from being cut down. But maybe it's more than that. It generates new life even when it dies, and that life in turn brings more life.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege. We'll take what you say to heart and hopefully can turn it into both the love of the world and action. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Really great to talk to you.
Thank you. It's a really great privilege to meet you. Thank you.